Hello, and thank you for joining us for the first episode of the Data Monetization webinar series. This episode will examine the relationship between data and value. This is the first episode of a 6-part series, which will take place every other Thursday through mid-December. A recording of the webinar and the slides will be made available to all registrants. Feel free to enter any questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom menu. And we invite you to follow us on LinkedIn to see news about other upcoming webinars. And with that, I'll turn things over to our moderators.
Thank you, Michelle. Welcome everybody to the first in our data monetization series. Today we have a terrific panel of scientists and data scientist specialists with us today. We've got Manjeet Rege, who is a PhD in computer science and director of the Center of Applied Artificial Intelligence at University of St. Thomas. And Manjeet is a tremendously capable computer scientist in the big data area. We've got Bill Schmarzo, who's currently the Analytics Chair and Chief Innovation Officer at Hitachi, Vantara. And Bill's a fellow at the University of San Francisco and an adjunct professor. And he's a prolific author and a podcast, has his own podcast. We also have Michael Gale with us, who is CMO of Wind River and CEO Inc. Digital. And Michael is a tremendous speaker and has tremendous insights into this area. Also with us today is Sunil Arora, who is a principal at Schwegman Law Firm. This webinar series is Sunil's brainchild, and Sunil's a highly experienced intellectual property attorney who represents both startups and very large corporations, and does a lot of work, in particular in the med tech area, but also in the semiconductor arts. So we're lucky to have Sunil with us to bring some legal perspective. And so with that, I'd like to kind of, I guess, turn it over first to Manjeet to kind of give us a high-level overview. But basically what we're going to do is learn a little bit about what it is data really is that we're talking about. We're going to talk about a little bit about using data, kind of, monetizing it as a product, a little bit about data strategy, and then just kind of touch on some examples of data monetization in industry around the world, and then a little touch on the legal aspect at the end for this webinar. In future webinars, we'll spend more time on the legal aspects as we explore each various different verticals of data monetization. So with that, let me turn it over to Manjeet and let him get rolling.
Great. Thanks, Steve. I'm very excited to be part of this panel. So I'm going to start off, talking about enterprise data and how that differs from the traditional historical data. So when you think about historically, when we refer to enterprise data, it was mostly transactional in nature. When somebody, let's say, walked into your store, for example, and bought something. But now we all are data generators, whether it is the car that we drive or the numerous apps that we use on our smartphones. Your consumer, while driving a car, while searching on an e-commerce site or on an app, is giving you information about their preferences. A smart connected car generates about 25 gigabytes of data every hour. So when we talk about monetizing enterprise data, we are talking about deriving value from this data that can help you learn about the consumer, and in return serve your consumer better by customizing your current offering or coming up with a new offering or a service. So I want to introduce this notion of data as a product. One of the goals of data science is not just applying big data or machine learning or AI techniques on the data, but also to engineer intelligent software applications that can serve your consumers better. So when I say deriving value from data, one has to begin thinking about building services based on that data. So a data product has typically the following three characteristics. First, they are built from data. So think about the smart digital assistants like Alexa or Google Home or a smart thermostat, for example. They are built on large amounts of data that was already collected by the enterprise. Second, the very act of using them generates more data, right? So every time you adjust your thermostat, or every time you interact with Google Home or Alexa, it is generating more data. And this new data can then be used to improve the performance of that particular data product. So for smart assistants, it's about improving their accuracies, or for a smart thermostat, it's about learning the patterns of the usage of the consumer over a period of time. That brings me to data strategy. Data is now an enterprise digital asset which you can use to your own advantage. So you can use the data to defend your market share. Today, you might come up with your own search engine, but the kind of data that Google has collected over the years makes their search capability across different devices defendable. One point we want to emphasize in this webinar today is that data monetization does not mean selling the data out. Monetizing can be internal or external. Internal may lead to improving efficiencies like customer analytics, or robotic automation, or even improving your customer service by using natural language processing models, for example. So if you look at the picture here on the left, what I'm showing here is one can build an initial product, have users use that service for free, and then use that data that is being collected to build a better product. A good example of that is recommendations we get on Amazon, on Netflix, for example. External, on the other hand, may lead to newer consumer-facing data products. If you are able to collect and aggregate lots of data for your industry vertical, you could offer that raw aggregated data as a service. We often see, insight as a service, where you're summarizing your findings in that industry vertical and then directly offering insights like market studies about where the industry is headed, for example. Finally, one can have analytics enabled platform as a service, where you can host the data and analytics tool as a service, where users can use that data on your platform and derive their own conclusions. So it is important to have a holistic data strategy, where you might have seen large tech companies that offer a service for free. Why do they do that? The users sign up, begin using the service. You're able to then capture that data. You can use that data for coming up with another service, and then that is where you monetize on your second product eventually. So a good strategy is, a good data strategy is like a roadmap which lays out a plan about investing in acquiring the data before the data begins to start paying off eventually. Without a good data strategy, an enterprise may invest in to begin with, but give up before the payoff starts. With that, I'll hand it over to our next panelist and a great speaker, Michael Gale.
Thank you. This is actually a great setup because I think what we've talked about are examples of structured and unstructured data. You know, when we get to Amazon or we speak to Siri or Alexa, sometimes I think there's a slight sense of concern, but invariably there's a wonderful sense of almost pre-anticipation. And because we basically live in this data-orientated world, we have to think a little bit about this idea of the power of unstructured data, because when we understand linear value, it's relatively straightforward. But digital transformation, which is at the essence of the Wall Street Journal best-selling book we wrote, really argues that there are two core digital DNA components that empirically drive success. So about 560 of the Global 2000 have made this successful digital transformation journey so far since 2013. It's a terribly small number. And in fact, the actual migration rate, when you look at it annually, is a really horrendous 11.4%, because this is tough. This is not a natural migration to the future. It does demand some changes in frameworks, thinking, and actually an ability to get very comfortable getting uncomfortable. So Dan, could you move to the next slide? Dan, you may have to share sound, I think. So you can see what Robert Downey Jr. is saying there. You can't hear it, which is fine. But it is this construct that data, as he said it, is the clay that helps build bricks. And that is a really good metaphor for the world we live in, because fundamentally, clay is a relatively unformed value, but it's the formation of that clay into structure that then allows you to build ideas and processes. So when we think about unstructured data, I really want us to be able to lean back and understand, whereas before our history was very simple, dashboards, linear models, TQM, you know, courtesy of the American Society of Quality and Malcolm Baldrige, all very much drove our preceding 30 to 40 years. The next 2, 3, 5 years is actually about our ability to get into that clay, mold it into bricks, and then build what we want. They're not going to be easily pullable items off a shelf. Dan, can you move to the next slide?
Just check the ground under the rear windows for any signs of footprints not your own. Data. I cannot make bricks without clay.
So just think about your worlds as being clay worlds. Now, the book took, 5 years to write. My wife wasn't very happy about that. But one of the things we recognize is of those 7 digital DNA components, 2 in particular are going to drive your ability to be successful in this new world. I mean, one forgets with Amazon, there were multitudes of companies attempting to compete with Amazon, including eBay. Amazon's capacity to constantly evolve the value of their data is absolutely based on these 2 elements. In fact, they were part of work we did with them in 97, 98 to really understand what the future world could look like. So at one end, they're selling an O'Reilly book on COBOL programming, the first book that they ever sold. And at the far end, they're actually literally enabling people to buy Caterpillar tractors at $80,000 through their portal. So let me walk through the first one. As leaders, you have to be what we call digital helix explorers. And I'll talk a little bit about themes and streams in a minute. Dan, could you move to the next video?
It's difficult to appreciate how violent it actually is. When you're coming up into the Dunlop chicane, the first braking point, you're hitting the pedal probably with about 80 kilograms of force.
This is a violent journey. And the only reason why I use an example from Audi is they themselves are going through this data shift model as they move from diesel and combustion to electric, that their legal department has increased 5 times in size through this process because they get that data is the future of Audi, how they collect, organize, and distribute and reconnect that data is an absolutely essential part of their future economic value. But they can't do that unless they spend time. So whereas this may feel like, oh, I'm going to be on a seminar for 30 minutes, I get it. The organizations that were the most successful with this new data model for business economics, their executives spent on average 17.4 hours a week dealing with this issue of data and digital transformation. That's two and a quarter, maybe in a COVID day, 1.5 days of actual work. This isn't something you can do in a small amount of time. The chance of being successful, if you spend 17.4 hours a week on this, is literally 98%. You will be part of that, 560 of the global 2000 that get it right. The chance of failure actually occurs from about 16.5 hours downwards. There's an issue about intensity here that really drives it. So if you want to be successful monetizing data in your organization, it is not a casual journey. It's a complex, hard, and tough process. But the outcome values, as I've said, Amazon's first book, an O'Reilly programming book, to the fact they now sell Caterpillar excavators and tractors, illustrates the enormity of the value if you keep at it. So Dan, can you move to the next slide? So we talk about data in the book and elsewhere as falling into what I call a themes and streams model. And I'll go through this with some haste because I don't want to catch up other people's time. But whereas traditionally we've built an idea, a dashboard, a daily performance, and we have data that sits in that dashboard, themes and streams argue that actually streams of data can go across themes or ideas. So I'll give you a simple example. Audi is realizing in the auto industry that the data they're getting back in their cars, the telemetry data, is actually really useful for making and repairing roads. In the area of Saxony, one of the German districts, they spend about $250 million a year understanding their decay in road conditions. Do roads behave well in the wet? Are things falling off roads? What Audi's realized is that the data they're collecting in all their cars could immediately be sent to the government in Saxony on an ongoing basis to actually feed live data into that system so they don't have to spend what is basically $250 million a year tracking road usage. They've understood that the data in the car that's valuable for Audi is also in the car at that moment valuable for local governments. So thinking about data in this sort of theme, ideas, and streams where that data flows means you become much more of a fisherman, a sort of catchy net process. And these 7 rules, which is really an understanding of it's cross-functional, you're going to have to adjust, occur quickly. USAA, one of the best insurance companies in the world, changes its management dashboard every 2 days. Because if issues that were relevant today aren't relevant tomorrow, don't report them. So that dynamic sense of use of data for changing business decisions on weather, insurance claims is really vital. You have to share this with everybody. This isn't just a management priority. Transparency in this theme and stream is vital. You've got to change the way you interact with data to act quickly. Speed of action invariably exceeds quality of perfection. And as you go through these 7 factors, these should be your guiding daily principles for this process. Dan, could you just quickly move to the next slide? This is loud. This is like a Pachinko machine. Think about where the data is, where it's coming from, where it's going to, where it could be, what it's approved for, where it drops out, what it's married to, and even where data is divorced from. If you take this Pachinko view of the world, you will work out where the monetization is. Can you just click to the next one, Dan? I'm just be careful of time. In fact, we'll click past this to the next one just because I want to be careful with time.
We're doing good on time.
Okay,
Mike.
cool. So take a hospital. I'm going to give you a real example. Type 2 diabetes, which maybe is an artifact of the way we feed and don't exercise in this country, is an enormous issue. And in fact, just to give you some context, there's a belief that in India and China, within 5 years, there will be 600 million citizens with dangerous levels of type 2 diabetes. That's a huge economic challenge, not just for health systems and for our own individual wellness, but for countries. So when you start looking at a hospital system as almost a data market, a data model, you start to understand the power of this information. So here's an example in a project we're involved in Chicago with the medical system. When somebody comes in for some of those initial type 2 diabetes measures after maybe a sort of frequent blood test, they'll go to another phlebotomist that may pull the blood, and then they go to see a specialist, well, then that specialist will send them then to the pharmacy. Well, you can't track a body between the doctor's office to the pharmacy. But we were able to find out that those that didn't go to the pharmacy immediately after seeing the doctor were actually 50% more likely not to be able to solve their diabetic score requirements in the first 90 to 120 days. And if you can't take immediate action, once you get past 120 days, it just gets exponentially more difficult to change behavior and your A1C score, which is a huge economic impact to systems and everything else. So why it sounds odd is that they were able to work out if somebody went from the doctor past the pharmacist, it takes less than 5 minutes in a particular hospital. So they worked out that sending people a notification saying, hey, you missed the telemetry point of the pharmacist, please go back and spend 5 minutes, actually increased compliance to medical prescription for type 2 by like 200%. And so this is where this sort of weird unstructured data, why does it matter if I go from the doctor past the pharmacist, becomes incredibly valuable in a whole range of economic systems and outcomes. So thinking about the world and where this unstructured data has value across those streams and themes requires leaders to lean in, to really lean in and not just pay attention to the base dashboard mechanics, but an understanding of what the incredible economic power can be behind sort of unstructured data. I think when we listen to the rest of the speakers today, they're going to talk about frameworks and ideas that go behind this thesis. But these models applied in all of the 11 industries we looked at, everything from energy and utility to avionics and defense, because unstructured data and data monetization are naturally married couples in the digital economy. So let me pass over to the next speaker.
And before we move over to Bill Schmarzo, I do want to highly recommend Michael's book, The Digital Helix. And I think we're going to have some opportunity for participants today in the webinar to get access to that book at either free or at a discounted.
You will have it free because we spread knowledge. We all get better.
Terrific book. So you should get it and read it if you're interested in this topic. Now, Bill, you want to take it from there?
Sure. So following Michael and all his cool slides is difficult because I look like I draw my slides with crayons, and I think I actually do. But let me sort of build on how Michael and Manjeet set stage up here. If we believe that data is the new oil, if we believe that in the same way that oil fueled the economic growth in the 20th century, that data will serve that same catalyst purpose or role in driving the economic growth of the 21st century, then the single most important question an organization must ask itself is the one located in the middle here. That is, how effective is your organization at leveraging data and analytics to power your business models? And we've talked a lot about frameworks here. And what we're going to talk about is I'm going to build on what Manjeet talked about as far as how you drive monetization. But it takes a different frame. Possession of data is not an asset. In fact, when the minute you start collecting data, you're incurring costs and liabilities. And so what organizations need to do is they need to figure out how effective are they. This may be the single most important question an organization can ask itself. And when we ask companies this question, talking about how data is a new oil and how effective are you, most organizations have no idea how to answer that question. They lack a benchmark, a best in practice that shows them what good looks like with respect to becoming more efficient, more effective at leveraging data and analytics. And what we find, and I won't drain this slide, in my class I teach, we spend the first day of school of the class just on this slide. Because what we found through our research is that organizations tend to sit along one of 5 different points on this big data business model maturity index. And by the way, the key phrase there is not a maturity index of how good you are using neural networks or SQL or TensorFlow or whatever. No, it's about business. It's about how are you leveraging the aspects of data and analytics to power your business. And unfortunately for most organizations, they find themselves stuck at the business monitoring phase. That is, they're using data and analytics to tell them what happened, a retrospective view of the business, which is important, but making decisions based on retrospective views of the business is like trying to drive your car using a rear view mirror. And so what we found is that organizations to transition up this maturity model to get over that analytics chasm that separated them from business monitoring to business insights and such, was they had to embrace a concept around economics and the economics of big data to make that transition. It wasn't a technology transition. It was more of an economics and how organizations are monetizing the data they have. Now, I'm very quick here. If you take a look at this chart, the very first three phases here are very much focused on internal monetization, right? How am I taking my current business use cases and key processes and leveraging detailed analytics around customers, products, and operations to predict what's likely to happen so I can prescribe in order to optimize, right? That is the heart of where most organizations start. It's the low-hanging fruit, taking your existing use cases and processes and using data and analytics, using AI and ML, and driving it to optimization. But what happens next is interesting. When you get to that fourth phase, notice it doesn't say data monetization. And I think the point has been made very clear. People aren't interested in buying your data. You're not going to make a lot of money selling your data. What's of value in your data are the insights about your customers, your processes, your competitors, your operations, your markets. It's the insights that's valuable. And when you start thinking about how do you monetize insights, I want to give you a little hint. What we find works best when we talk with customers is to make certain you understand your customer segments very, very well, to the point that you understand what decisions they're trying to make. Instead of selling data, instead of selling insights, try selling decisions. Build new services that helps your customers make better decisions. You want to figure out how to get from your house to your restaurant in the most convenient, hassle-free way, right? That decision has been solved by Uber and Lyft. Think about how you sell decisions. And by the way, the last stage here, digital transformation, just a real quick phrase on it. What is digital transformation? Well, in my opinion, digital transformation is about setting up a culture that is continuously learning and adapting, that not only leverages technologies like deep learning and AI to build assets that continuously learn and adapt, but equally important is how are you empowering your frontline employees, the people who engage with customers or the operations of the business? How are you empowering them to continuously learn and adapt? And that's all built upon a culture of sharing best practices. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges I've wrestled with in my career, and I've been doing this for 40 some years, is determining the value of data has always been a struggle for me. So at the University of San Francisco, it's nice to be a professor there because you have access to a lot of really smart, really motivated, free resources who can do some work for us, work for me. And so I set them off on this challenge to figure out and find for me an asset that looks like data. Because my mindset, my frame that I had talked about here and thought about creating the value of data was always an accounting frame. I wanted to be able to put data on my balance sheet. I want to be able to show how data is something that can be reflected in the price of a stock. And then one of my research assistants comes to me and says, Professor Schmarzo, I can't find an asset that looks like data. I can't find an asset anywhere that looks like data. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, data is an asset that never depletes, never wears out, and can be used across an unlimited number of use cases at zero marginal cost. Now, when she said the word zero marginal cost, I realized that my problem was I had the wrong frame. And a lot of the problems I see when I talk to customers is they have the wrong frame. Well, my frame I had come into is I was thinking about it from an accounting perspective, which is, the possession of data in itself is a value. I'll be real honest with you. Possession of data is not only a value, it's actually a cost and a liability. It isn't having data that is a value, which is accounting mindset. It's how you use it. It's a value and use methodology. And you start, and that's an economics concept. And you start thinking about this from an economics perspective, all of a sudden you start to unleash all these economic concepts that I can start applying to trying to drive value out of my data. The one that's most relevant to me is the economic multiplier effect, how I can keep using this same data set. In this case, customer point of sales data. I can use it in sales to improve promotional effectiveness. I can use it in marketing to improve customer acquisition. I can use it in the call center to improve customer retention. I use it in product. You can see the thread here, right? And every one of these use cases has value, 2.5% improvement, 2.0% improvement. Here's the beauty of this. Other than that first use case, every subsequent use case gets access to that data, can use that data at a zero marginal cost. You have no assets like this. And yet we don't think about this. We have the wrong frame for how we're thinking about monetizing our data. Next slide, please. I think this statement from Elon Musk is the most provocative statement I've heard in decades. If you buy a Tesla today, I believe you're buying an appreciating asset, not a depreciating asset. Now, when you think about that, now the first reaction most people had, being that a lot of folks don't really appreciate the humor and brilliance that is Elon Musk, is most people thought, oh yeah, I'm going to buy a Tesla, I'm going to stick it in my garage, and 20 years from now, it's going to be worth a whole boatload of money. No, there's 600,000 of these things roaming around the streets. That number is going rapidly. No, this is not like a 1964 and a half Ford Mustang. No, the reason why these assets are appreciating in value, the more that they are used, the more valuable they become, is because Elon Musk has built his car around an AI ML platform that is continuously learning and adapting based on every turn of the steering wheel, every corner it takes, every car it passes. It is using every opportunity in the data it collects to learn. Heck, this car, when it's not running in semi-autonomous mode, runs in shadow mode. It learns from its customers, transfer learning, right? It's learning from its drivers even when it's not turned on. And what happens is every night, the learnings from each of these cars gets sent back to a giant Tesla cloud where all the learnings are aggregated and put together and then finally back propagated back. So anything that one car learns, all cars learn. So if there's one car that was in an accident that was avoidable, it figures out how it could have avoided that, and now every car knows how to avoid that accident. And what's happening here is Elon Musk is playing a great game. Right, he's exploiting the law of compounding, that he can continuously improve the operations of his autonomous self-driving engine, the beast that makes these things work. If I can compound that 1% over 365 days, at the end of a year, I've got a 37.8x improvement. That he's exploiting the game-changing value here. And he's doing it right in front of us because now he's not thinking about data as the asset. He's thinking about how I am leveraging the analytics to continuously learn and build these assets that appreciate. Next slide, please. My last one. So I'm going to argue right now that in knowledge-based industries, the economies of learning are more powerful than the economies of scale. And pretty soon, every industry is going to be a knowledge-based industry. The ability to learn, share, fail, learn, share becomes the differentiating factor that'll differentiate those companies that survive this digitalization that's going on right now and those that do not. Now, this is the Schmarzo economic digital asset valuation theorem. This is how all these different things manifest itself. And you can see over in the upper right-hand corner, this is my futile effort to try to get a Nobel Prize in economics. But when you start thinking about the reuse and the economics and the sharing and the continuous learning and adapting of data and analytics, there are three things that happen. But the frame you need to take at this is you need to look at it on a use case by use case basis. What I mean is that as you go use case by use case, so the first one maybe is targeting vendor reliability, and then it's targeting vendor supply, quality of supply, and then it's targeting inventory. I mean, use case by use case. What happens as you go from use case to use case? Three things happen. Number one, use case, by reusing your data and your analytic assets, you reduce your marginal costs. What you're going to find is not all your data is valuable. And you're also going to uncover that you're missing data that has huge value that you don't collect, which is going to impact and affect your instrumentation strategy. But effect number one is your marginal costs are going to flatten because you're reusing these data and analytic assets. Great. Effect number two, the value grows because use case by use case, I can now accelerate time to value and de-risk projects associated with use cases. I can get these things done faster because I'm reusing the data that's already been tested and blessed. I'm reusing the analytic assets that have already been validated for me. Effects 1 and 2 in of themselves are enough of a reason to embrace this economies of learning aspect of data and analytics. But effect number 3, the Tesla effect, the TensorFlow effect, the Elon Musk effect, that any of these assets, these analytic assets that I improve, that my giant big-brained data scientist takes one of these, my fully self-driving FSD analytic model that drives my autonomous vehicles and makes it 1% more effective. Every previous use case that uses that analytic asset just got 1% more effective. And so I'll conclude with that. If you have a chance to vote, again, Schmarzo, SCHMARZO, Nobel Prize in Economics would certainly make my day.
Bill. Yeah, I wanted to note that I think I erroneously maybe said that Bill had a podcast. That's actually Manjeet, who has a podcast, All Things Data, and Bill's a blogger. And Bill, you've got a blog. You blog under your own name. And where can we find your blog?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter, though I'm very careful to stay within my swim lane on Twitter. It's very easy to get pulled into all kinds of bad conversations on Twitter. But you can find me, again, Schmarzo, just my last name on either LinkedIn or Twitter. And I try to post a blog a week on topics related to data and analytics. But I am kind of behind because I'm just finishing up my 4th book, which is called The Economics of Data Analytics and Digital Transformation.
Awesome. So there is one question that's come in here. Let me just take a look here. So this question is, in these days of multiple privacy laws, GDPR and CCPA, et cetera, who owns the data and what controls the consumer, control of the data? I'm not sure if we're really going to have time or are prepared to answer that question today. It's a terrific question. From a legal perspective, we have webinars coming up where we're going to address those questions. Neither Sunil or I would dare to answer that question, but we will have experts in those areas in future webinars. But if any of the panelists want to take a shot at this, having been experienced with it in any kind of practices you've encountered, you can go ahead and answer that question.
Well, I'll take first shot at it. Since I worked at Yahoo, I was the vice president of advertiser analytics. We wrote our contracts in a way that we own the data. Obviously, the privacy laws have changed since my days there, but privacy has always been a big issue. But to a certain extent, I'm not selling data at Yahoo. I'm selling decisions. If I think about my audience I had to serve, so my audience were advertisers. In particular, my personas I was going after were the media planners and buyers who determined how to spend advertising dollars, and then the campaign managers who ran campaigns and had a chance to actually move money around during campaigns. And so what my team did is we figured out and went through a detailed design process with our stakeholders in those spaces and identified the decisions they were trying to make, and we built analytics around those. And so we could tell them what audiences were responding to what ads, and where to best show that, at what time of day, where to put it on the page, et cetera, et cetera. So we didn't really expose the user's data, but we certainly used it to build models, and the models then told us what those natural likely behaviors of those consumers were. And we certainly owned the outcomes of those models.
Michael, did you have any comments on that? You might be on mute, Michael, if you're trying to say something.
So I think that's a great question, Steve. I would like to maybe use that as a segue to ask a question to Bill. I liked Bill's example of Tesla and Tesla learning from the driver's behavioral patterns, and then overnight building these models in the cloud, and then kind of back propagating them into the cars. So Bill, so right now Tesla is in the car business, but tomorrow if they get into insurance business and they have access to all of this driving patterns of data, Of course, that would be external monetization, right? Because right now they are doing internal monetization for improving their self-driving cars, but they can now come up with premiums about how you have been driving their cars. And with regard to this question that we had, where does that leave privacy? Because they have access to all of this data about the way I drove their cars over the past 5 years.
The Tesla example is a great one. I agree. They're not an auto company. They're not a transportation company. And people will say, well, they're a data company. And I would argue, no, they're actually an analytics company that knows how to get value. So your example with insurance is a great one, because they could go into a model where they could provide insurance as a service. The only time you need your insurance is when you're actually driving it. When the car's sitting in your driveway or in your garage, why are you paying insurance on it? And because they understand your patterns, and they understand when you're actually driving the car, and they can benchmark you as a driver against the best drivers and score you as far as how good you are, they could directly impact how they offer insurance on demand. But here's why I think Tesla is even more interesting. And by the way, I do not have any special insights into Tesla. I'll tell you, I get most of my insights from Tesla by going through their job ads to see who they're hiring, what kind of skill sets they're working on. And the thing I find most interesting about Tesla is that they use video cameras, not LiDAR, on their cars. And as they're driving around the roads, they're capturing all this video information. License plates of cars, makes of cars, how old those cars are. As they drive by a mall or a retail store, they can see how many cars are in the parking lot. They can see if there's people standing in line outside the Apple store for a new release. They know probably more about the U.S. economy based on what they see than our Fed or any other organization does. And they are a master at monetizing the data with their analytics. So from I look at them, I can only imagine where they're going to go, because Elon Musk is not afraid to try and fail, and he's not afraid to push the edges. And so I think there's a lot of really cool stuff going to happen out of Tesla. It's like watching them is just. Here's what I find really frustrating. He's got this model right in front of our face, and 99.999% of companies just don't get it. Google, by the way, does the same thing with their TensorFlow machine learning AI framework. Make it freely available. Why would Google make their single most important technology that drives their search and all their other businesses? Why would they make it freely available? Why? Because everybody who uses it across all this wide variety of use cases makes that technology more effective. And who is the master at leveraging that technology with their data? Google. So anyway, right in front of our faces, the world is changing.
So we got a couple of questions that just came in. One is, do any of the panelists know of any company that's just basically taking an aggregation strategy to collect data from different companies and different places, and then try to do a giant data analytics, if you will, on everything collected together?
I would argue most companies are doing that because consumer data is heterogeneous in nature. And if you take example of Google, for example, you're interacting with Google on your different devices. You're talking to Google through the smart digital assistants. And then through their partners, they have information about how you have been interacting with different partners as well. So I think eventually when Google aggregates all of this data to build a profile of a person, it is using that kind of an aggregator model. I don't know what Bill perhaps have to add to that, maybe.
I think that's a good answer. I really don't have anything to add. I don't think, to be honest with you, most companies know what they're doing with their data. They just haven't matured. Most organizations still see data as a cost to be avoided, not as an asset to be exploited. So I think your answer is really good.
Yeah, because if as an enterprise you only look at that one channel through which you're collecting the data with your consumer, I think that will be a big mistake. You have to kind of go all out and get the different dimensions of your consumer interacting with the data and then aggregate it at your end.
That's a good setup. That's a really good point. Let me riff off of that. I think what we did at Yahoo was we built customer journey maps to really understand how our customers were operating, and then try to build analytics around the key decisions they were making. I think for organizations who are looking to monetize that data they have externally, you have to know your customers intimately. You have to know the kind of decisions they're making, the kind of environment they're working in, what the latency of the decisions need to be, et cetera, et cetera. This is where a concept called design thinking becomes so critical. Yep. Design thinking forces you to wear your shoe or walk in the shoes of your customer to really understand what they're doing. And if you understand what they're trying to do, it gives you a chance not only to monetize their processes, but in some cases, actually totally reinvent that process using data and analytics and the predictive and prescriptive characteristics of data and analytics.
So I've got several good questions here that have come in. I'm going to take them out of order in the interest of time. And two of them are somewhat similar. One is, can you put some light on pricing value of data for selling data at a data marketplace exchange or legal implications? And the other one is, could you give us references to analyze the cost and pricing of the data we collect and the latter we sell? And they say in our case, we collect data from the environment for scientific and development purposes. And those data could be offered to government agencies and companies for them to make decisions. Any comments on that?
I think, the point that I think Bill made earlier was about, people or other business partners are mostly not interested in raw data. I mean, you'll have less market for raw data. And so if you're thinking about monetizing in terms of sharing your aggregated data, there is less value for it. But what others are mostly interested in is the insights or the decisions. That was the point that Bill made. So if you can build models based on your aggregated data, that is directly usable by other partners, I think that becomes a highly probable business. Bill?
Yeah, it's a great point. And some experience I've had recently, a lot of government agencies are running these open data initiatives, right? Where they take their traffic data or their train data or whatever data they got, and they put it in some sort of a data lake, and they open the doors and say, people go forth and be fruitful. And it's crickets. It's not working. The problem with these open data initiatives is that there's no guidelines given to the people who are working with this data, trying to understand what decisions are my stakeholders trying to make. Think about traffic, for example. What's the right time to leave home? What's the right path I take, right? Should I avoid certain situations, right? This can become more and more important as we get autonomous vehicles doing this sort of stuff. So I find that these open data initiatives are failing miserably because you just can't make data available. Data, the only way to be able to tease out signal from noise in the data is to understand the use case you're going after and the decisions that are comprised around that use case. But yet we seem to think if we just make the data available, magic shit's gonna happen. Well, magic shit doesn't happen. It never has happened. And so again, there has to be this effort put in to really understand your stakeholders. What are they trying to do? What environment do they operate in? What's the journey they're going on? These are all design thinking techniques that we embrace. Our data science team, we have design thinkers on our data science team. Yes, we're weird, but we realize that the best way to build analytic models that are most effective and relevant is that they gotta be built with the customer stakeholder usage in mind. And that's where this power of decisions, understanding decisions and selling decisions makes this whole thing come together, at least for us.
So I've got thank you, Bill. I've got a couple of other things I want to get to here. One is Sunil had a question or two, but before I get to Sunil's question, I had one I'd like to interject in between, which is, so why is this becoming so big now? I would say, quote, all of a sudden, but I mean, it seems like it's become a really huge, important thing in the last 5 to 10 years. We've had lots and lots of data for decades that people have collected, in computer systems. What's changed now that's making this so much more important and valuable for the economy?
Three things. Number one, the cost of storing data has gone down significantly. So there is no cost at the enterprise level to store the data. Second, in the past, we were limited by compute power. Now, by embracing cloud, you have access to limitless compute power. Earlier you had to invest in hardware to build models. Now you don't have to do this. So that upfront cost that existed in the past is not there anymore due to cloud. Third, when you think about these, deriving insights based on deep learning models, as a researcher, in the past, you did not have access to large amounts of data. One of the hallmarks of a deep learning model is the ability to learn from large amounts of data. So 25 years ago, if you were an AI researcher, you did not have access to large amounts of data. So these three things, having access to large amounts of data, the cost of storing going down, and then having access to compute power has led to researchers developing these newer algorithms that are able to derive insights, which you can then monetize.
I'm going to riff on that. I think that's the perfect. And I'm going to tell you one word that enabled this, and that was Hadoop.
Yeah.
Hadoop is, when I was at Yahoo, we developed Hadoop at that time. I mean, it wasn't me who did that. There was people with much bigger brains than me. But what we found from Hadoop was that it did dramatically drop the cost of storing data. And what happened, what's most interesting about big data is not the volume of data, it's the granularity. It's the fact that I knew for each of my 500 million visitors that came to Yahoo, I had built a very detailed profile, propensity profile on each and every one of them. I knew what products they were interested in. I knew what sites they went to. I knew what keywords they searched on. I knew what they clicked on. I knew what they didn't click on. And I used that to build these very detailed behavioral profiles. The second point to it, Hadoop also allowed me to unleash huge amounts of compute power. Because these deep learning models and these supervised and unsupervised machine learning models and this reinforcement learning models, they take a lot of compute to churn through all that data to build out these propensity models. So I think Hadoop opened our eyes to the power. Now the cloud has sort of taken that and exploded that even further. And so no longer is technology a limiter to us. We're not trying to take an Oracle relational database and make it do things with data that it was never designed to do, right? Making Oracle analyze terabytes and petabytes of data was like making a dog walk on its hind legs. Yeah, it was great if you could do it, but I didn't want that dog to bring my beer to me. But it changed the entire capability of what we could do. The realm of what was possible changed dramatically. And the companies that really broke this open, I mean, the company that broke it open was Google, right? And Amazon as well. They're the ones who, I mean, Yahoo may have developed this thing, but Google's the one that ran it to perfection.
Yeah, and just to add a couple of points, in my big data class, I show Yahoo's Hadoop cluster, a picture of that, and some of the initial work was done by Google when they came out with the Hadoop file system. Yep. Yahoo came out with Pig, which was a big data processing language. Facebook came out with Hive. And now, Facebook has made available a number of deep learning libraries, and so has Google as well. So now, all of them have kind of joined the party, and the advancements are being made, and we all can derive value from it.
So with that, I would like to, while we still have time, Sunil, you had one or two questions that you had talked about before, and I was wondering if you wanted to tee those up, and then hopefully we can get through those because we've got two other questions that we could maybe wrap up at the end. So maybe we got 3 minutes to try to answer Sunil's questions and go from there. Sunil?
Sure. Let me just start it out with a comment in terms of, the genesis for this whole webinar series, I think, was the fact that more of our clients were asking these questions about data monetization. And pretty notably, it's been across all industries. I think there's a lot of Internet of Things type inventions that we're seeing at the firm. And you know, things are just more capable of acquiring data, and that is being built into the products. We're seeing more inventions that pertain to monitoring as well, or have monitoring capabilities. So that was the genesis for this webinar series. That's why we brought these experts in. We wanted to spend this session talking about the business aspects of it. The questions we got earlier about ownership and privacy are pretty complicated for a single business-oriented webinar session, and we'll be handling those in subsequent webinars because the laws relating to ownership and privacy are complicated, not only internationally, but even within the US. There is a moving target of different state laws that are coming into play that address these sorts of issues. Another comment that I just wanted to address is that there was a comment that was made earlier that it's not just raw data that is capable of being monetized, but it's actually the insights that are more important. And I think we're seeing that, and those insights are actually leading to more patenting opportunities. And so we're trying to, as a firm, train our attorneys to be looking not just at the products, but also all the different ways that the products can be used and data can actually be acquired and leveraged for monetization purposes. And that can be, from a patenting perspective, it can involve anything from the business method patents, thinking about things from a user interface perspective, and also thinking about how to claim things from an artificial intelligence or machine learning perspective, because obviously, you know, data has value as training data for models, and the models themselves have value. But with that, I wanted to, you know, really ask the panelists here if they have any, you know, good examples that they like to bring to bear about how people can think about things beyond their primary markets or direct use cases of products, and examples of how secondary markets and use cases can be considered early on, and how startups should really be thinking about this.
So maybe there's one rule that we've learned is that life is a set of telemetry data, and that the moments we function in have unbelievable value to others. So the first exercise I encourage all startups to do is to sit in a room and saying, what's the core of our business? And if you don't get to the answer that you're a data business, you're probably still living somewhat in the 20th century. If you recognize you're a data business, you should just write on a whiteboard, ideate really, as many possible ways that your data can be used. You then sit back, look at it, and recognize that some of those ideas, in fact, most of the ideas are probably true. Then you've got to work out what your appetite is. If you say, look, 3, 4, 5, 6 connections down the path, we could do this, you're probably looking too far down the path. So you should look at your own business, your own data requirements, and then frankly, think about what the first, second, and third degree of connections are to that. And then I think, you know, as we've all looked at, what the economics in that journey is. So if I collect telemetry data on the car and want to sell it back to the state of Saxony, do I have an ecosystem that would allow me to sell it back? Do I have an ecosystem that would allow me to constantly deliver it? Those become bigger issues than just monetization, which is what's the incremental cost and the complexity of the ecosystem necessary to make money out of it. So think of all the ways. Think of the first, second, third, fourth type level connect, and then really work out your ecosystem for delivery, because it looks easy on a whiteboard. It's freaking difficult to do in real time.
I would second that. The only riff I would add to that is, as you think about how your data could be used, make sure you understand who your stakeholders are. And sometimes the stakeholders are customers of your customers. In fact, understanding who your customers of your customers are may allow you to disintermediate people. And that's where a lot of startups are having success. So the stakeholders, a thorough understanding of the stakeholders, personas, journey maps, stakeholder mapping, all that kind of stuff that design thinking teaches you, I find it invaluable in helping to make certain that my my team and my data science work we're doing is really focusing on delivering things of what we know have value. And we use decisions. I mean, the challenge you're going to have is not identifying the data you have, but really identifying the sources of value creation across your customers and markets. That's where design thinking can help.
Manjeet, were you going to take the question that somebody didn't hear about
Yeah.
yeah.
Sure. So earlier we were talking about the contributions of companies like Yahoo and Google. And what we were talking about was, instead of processing your data on one computer, you begin processing that data on a cluster of computers. So either you build your own cluster of computers. That is what, in the initial days, Yahoo and Google did. And in order for you to store and process that data, an ecosystem that was proposed by Google and developed by Yahoo and others was called Hadoop. HAD as in dog, OOP. And then as part of that ecosystem, there are many different aspects to it, which help you store and process data in a distributed way. That is what we were talking about in our earlier answer.
Thank you. Well, we have, I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. I did want to note we will tell folks in a minute here how to get a free copy of the book. There was one question that came in that had to do with using big data or using data analytics and data feeds to monitor traffic and traffic violations. And of course, as somebody who's now constantly seeing everybody else drive twice as fast as I do, this sounds like a great idea, but not so much when I was about 25 years old. But I'm sure that will probably come to pass. And if it isn't already coming to pass in certain countries, although the US may be pretty slow to adopt that. But I mean, I've noticed you go over to the UK and you pretty much feels like your big brother is watching every move. I wanted to thank the panelists today. You guys just knocked the ball out of the park. You did a terrific job, and I really appreciate the time and effort that you put into preparing for this and all the slides. And after I saw Michael Gale's slides, I'll never feel ever good about my slides again as long as I live. I also wanted to say that in future webinars, we're going to dive into individual or different segments, industry segments. And when we do that, we're going to dive deeper into the legal aspects of this and be prepared to have people on the panel that'll answer these questions that are deeper questions. Someone did note to me, for example, Europe has a completely different, data rights regime, and perhaps things that were good at Yahoo, 10 years ago or 5 years ago, even maybe wouldn't fly in Europe these days. So don't take any of our comments today as being legal advice. We'll get to that later. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michelle to wrap it up and tell folks where they can get copies of things and such.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. So the next webinar in this series is coming up on Thursday, October 22nd. It will be about data monetization in medical devices, healthcare, and insurance. And if you are interested in a copy of Michael Gale's book, please do email us at info, it's INFO, at slwip.com for the book. And thank you all so much for joining us.